Whispers of the Mirror. Chapter 1. The Return to Harper House. The sky above the Harper estate was smothered by thick, unmoving clouds, the kind that swallowed the light whole and left the world in a dull, suffocating gray. Chloé Harper gazed out the window of the car, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, her hands resting limply in her lap. The car moved slowly along the winding road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the house loomed ahead. Harper House, the home of her childhood, now seemed more like an ominous monument than a place of comfort. Its weathered brick walls were partially hidden by unruly ivy, crawling across the facade like veins. The roof sagged under its own weight, shingles missing here and there, as if the years had eaten away at its strength. It had been 2 years since she'd last set foot there, 2 years since she'd sworn never to return, and yet here she was, dragged back by circumstances beyond her control. The car came to a halt, the engine cutting off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the towering oaks that bordered the property. Chloé blinked at the sight before her. There was a stillness here, a suffocating quiet that settled into her bones the moment she opened the car door. She hesitated before stepping out, her sneakers sinking slightly into the damp earth, and the air tasted of damp wood and decay. Behind her, the driver unloaded her suitcase from the trunk, setting it beside her with a thud that seemed far too loud in the oppressive quiet. Chloé barely registered his nod before he was gone, the car pulling away down the path, disappearing into the mist that had begun to gather along the treetops. She was alone now, alone with the house. She stood there, staring at the front door. Its old wood was chipped and peeling, the paint long faded to a washed-out brown, a testament to the years it had endured. Her chest tightened as memories fluttered, unbidden, to the surface, of running through these halls with Claire, of laughter that now felt like it had belonged to a different life, of her father's voice calling out from somewhere deep within the house. Chloé swallowed hard, lifting her suitcase and trudging forward. The key was still in the same spot it had always been, beneath the third stone in the garden, hidden from view. Her fingers brushed the cold, rough edges of the stone as she moved it aside and retrieved the key, its brass tarnished from disuse. She unlocked the door with a metallic click, pushing it open with a groan of protest from the hinges. Inside, the house smelled of dust and neglect. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped across the threshold. Nothing had changed. The grand staircase still curved elegantly to the second floor. The chandelier above still hung crookedly, its glass beads yellowed with age. Portraits of distant relatives lined the walls, their eyes following her as she crossed the foyer. The weight of the house pressed in on her, heavy and thick, like the house itself was watching her return. Chloé set her suitcase down and stood still, listening to the house breathe around her. The ticking of the old grandfather clock echoed faintly from the hallway, its pendulum swaying with a steady rhythm. A faint draft stirred the curtains near the window, sending shivers through her body. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but it did little to quell the unease that had begun to creep into her mind. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement. Her head snapped toward the direction of the dining room, where shadows clung to the corners. But nothing moved. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of her memories and something else, something she couldn't yet place. Upstairs, a faint creak, almost imperceptible. Her mother was here somewhere, but Chloé hadn't seen her yet. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Eleanor Harper had always been a strange woman, eccentric to the point of unnerving, and after her father's death, she had grown even more detached. Chloé could picture her now, wandering the halls aimlessly, talking to the empty rooms as if they were alive. She wasn't sure she was ready to face her just yet. The house had a way of swallowing people, of making them feel small and insignificant in its vast, echoing rooms. Chloé felt it now more than ever. She moved through the foyer, her eyes catching on the faint outlines of familiar objects. A framed photo of her father's study, the grandfather clock her mother had always insisted was a family heirloom, the marble bust of a long-forgotten ancestor that sat atop a small pedestal. Each item seemed to whisper memories she was not yet ready to confront. The staircase loomed ahead, each step creaking as she ascended, gripping the banister to steady herself. The second floor was bathed in shadow, the only light coming from a single window at the end of the hallway. As she passed closed doors, her mind filled with the weight of what lay behind each one. Her old room, Claire's, the attic that had always frightened her as a child. The last door on the left was slightly ajar, and she paused, heart pounding, before pushing it open. Her father's study. The room had been left untouched since his death. Papers still cluttered the desk, a half-empty glass of scotch sat on the side table, and his favorite leather chair was pulled slightly away from the desk, as if he had only just stepped away. The air was thick with the scent of old books, and the curtains hung heavily over the windows, blocking out most of the light. Chloé stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, as if by entering, she would disturb something sacred. It was then that she noticed the mirror. It stood in the corner of the room, tall and imposing, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings twisting around its edges. Chloé didn't remember it being there before. In fact, she was certain it hadn't been. The mirror seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to this house, this family. She moved toward it slowly, her reflection growing larger as she approached. Her face stared back at her, pale and hollow-eyed. But there was something wrong with the image, something just beneath the surface that made her stomach churn. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the cool glass, and for a brief moment, the surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. Chloé yanked her hand back, heart racing, her pulse thundering in her ears. She blinked, staring into the mirror, but her reflection was the same as it had always been, just her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something unseen. Chloé turned away, her mind heavy with unease, but the sensation lingered, the mirror's presence pressing into her thoughts like a weight. The house had always been strange, full of dark corners and hidden spaces, but this was different. Something had changed in Harper House, and it wasn't just the grief left behind by her father's death. As she closed the door to the study, the mirror's image flickered in her memory. Chloé couldn't know then that the house had welcomed her back, that it had been waiting for her all along, waiting to consume her, piece by piece. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Walls. The first night back in Harper House was restless. Chloé lay in her old bedroom, the walls pressing in on her like a living thing. The ceiling too low, the air too still. The bed, though familiar, felt foreign beneath her body. The same floral-patterned bedspread was tucked neatly under her, the edges frayed from years of use, but it smelled faintly of mildew, as if it had been untouched since the day she left. The house had been waiting for her, stagnant, festering. She turned over, staring out the window where the night bled into the black silhouette of trees. The moon was a faint sliver, barely visible through the thick clouds. Every creak of the house, every shift in the floorboards, seemed amplified in the quiet. Chloé pulled the blanket closer, seeking some form of comfort, but found none. Her mind raced, swirling with memories of her father, of the last time she'd seen him alive. The way he had smiled at her before she left for school that day, a smile that hadn't reached his eyes. She remembered the smell of his cologne as he leaned down to kiss her forehead, the weight of his hand lingering on her shoulder. And then, nothing. The emptiness that followed. The phone call. The shock. The hollow ache that had filled her chest ever since. The house held all of that, tucked away in its dark corners, and being here again felt like prying open wounds that had never truly healed. The walls seemed to groan softly, like the house itself was shifting, settling into its bones. Chloe's eyes fluttered shut, sleep tugging at the edges of her consciousness. But just as she was about to drift off, she heard something, a soft sound, almost imperceptible. It was faint, barely a whisper, like the rustling of fabric or the scraping of nails against wood. Her eyes snapped open. The sound came again, a gentle scratching, so light it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady, and it seemed to be coming from behind the walls. Chloe sat up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. She strained to listen, every muscle in her body tense. The scratching continued, faint but persistent, as though something was trying to claw its way through the walls. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced around the room, eyes darting to the shadows in the corners, the old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the cold floorboards biting into her bare feet. The house felt alive around her, as though it was breathing in time with her, its creaks and groans matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. The scratching noise had stopped, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breaths filling the silence. Her mind raced with possibilities. Mice in the walls, the wind rattling the old beams, something perfectly mundane. She repeated this to herself over and over, but deep down, she knew it wasn't true. The house had always felt strange, even when she was a child. But now, there was something different, something darker. She rose to her feet, the hem of her nightgown brushing the floor as she padded across the room. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before she turned it, pulling the door open with a soft creak. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon seeping through the window at the far end. She stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor cold beneath her feet, the silence of the house oppressive. As she walked, her fingers grazed the faded wallpaper, feeling the rough texture beneath her skin. The scratching sound hadn't returned, but the weight of the house pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She passed by Claire's room, the door firmly shut, and then her parents' room, where she could still imagine her father sitting at the edge of the bed, lost in thought. Chloe paused, her eyes lingering on the door to the attic at the end of the hallway. It had always frightened her as a child. The narrow, twisting staircase that led up to it, the cold draft that seemed to seep from beneath the door, and the strange, almost mechanical noises that sometimes echoed from within. She had avoided it for as long as she could remember. But now, standing here in the dark, she felt an inexplicable pull toward it. She took a step closer, her bare feet whispering against the floor. The air grew colder the nearer she came to the attic door, a chill that cut straight through her nightgown and sent a shiver crawling up her spine. Her hand reached out before she could stop herself, fingers brushing the cold brass of the doorknob. The metal was frigid, like ice, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, a yawning black void that seemed to stretch on forever. The narrow staircase wound upward into the gloom, each step cloaked in shadow. A draft of cold air rushed out, ruffling the hem of her gown and brushing her face with the scent of dust and something else, something sour and metallic, like old blood. Chloe hesitated, her hand gripping the doorframe, her heart hammering in her chest. The darkness seemed to pulse, beckoning her forward, but every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her bedroom. She took a single step forward, the wooden stair creaking beneath her weight. The sound came again, the scratching, but this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from above. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her gaze shot upward, into the blackness that swallowed the staircase. The scratching was louder now, more insistent, as if something were dragging sharp claws across the wooden beams of the attic. The sound echoed down the stairs, reverberating through the narrow space, filling her ears until it was the only thing she could hear. Chloe's feet were frozen to the floor, her body locked in place by fear. The air around her had grown unbearably cold, and the shadows seemed to press in on her from all sides, suffocating, oppressive. For a moment, she was certain she saw movement, a faint glimmer of something shifting in the darkness above, something that glinted like eyes watching from the shadows. Without thinking, she turned and bolted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the floor as she fled from the attic door. Her heart thundered in her chest, and the cold air burned in her lungs as she raced back to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. She stood there, back pressed against the door, chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The house was silent again. The scratching had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, the weight of unseen eyes crawling across her skin. Chloé slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to ask. The attic had always been a place of fear for her, a forbidden space, but now it seemed more than just a room. There was something up there, something alive, something watching. And the house, this house that had been her home, that held so many memories, had become a stranger to her. As she sat there in the dark, the faintest sound echoed from the walls once more. A whisper, a scratch. The house was speaking, and though she couldn't understand its language, she knew one thing for certain. It was awake now, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Chapter 3. The House Remembers. Morning came slowly to Harper House, the pale light seeping through the heavy curtains like a reluctant visitor. Chloé sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes bloodshot and aching from a restless night spent listening to the groans of the house. She hadn't slept after her flight from the attic. The fear had clung to her, sharp and heavy, twisting in her gut like a knot she couldn't untangle. Her gaze drifted to the window. The mist still clung to the trees, shrouding the estate in a dense, gray fog. The world outside looked just as it had the night before, silent, oppressive, and somehow smaller, as if the house itself had grown around her during the night. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of old wood and something else, something sour that lingered just out of reach. Chloé pushed herself off the bed, her limbs heavy with fatigue, and padded across the room to the window. The glass was cool against her fingertips as she brushed them along the surface, her breath leaving a faint mist on the pane. She could barely make out the shape of the garden below, the once neatly trimmed hedges now wild and overgrown, like everything else in this house. She turned away from the window, her eyes falling on the door to her room. She didn't want to leave the safety of these four walls, but the pull of the house, of whatever it had become in the years she'd been gone, was too strong to ignore. The hallway was quiet when she stepped into it, the only sound the creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. The air felt different during the day, less suffocating but still charged with an invisible weight. The light was weak and gray, filtered through the grime-covered windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Chloé moved slowly, her fingers trailing along the faded wallpaper as she walked. She passed by the door to Claire's room, still shut, the brass doorknob dull with age. Claire was somewhere in the house, surely, but they hadn't crossed paths yet. The silence between them felt like a chasm, one that had been widening ever since the funeral, and Chloé wasn't sure she could face her older sister just yet. Not after the years of estrangement, not after their father's death had carved an even deeper wedge between them. Chloé's footsteps carried her to the grand staircase that spiraled down to the first floor. The banister, polished smooth from years of use, felt cold beneath her hand as she descended. The chandelier above, its crystals dulled with dust, swayed ever so slightly in the draft that flowed through the house. The foyer below was empty, the heavy front doors closed, locking her inside with the house's secrets. Her breath caught as she passed the doors, feeling a sharp pang of something. Guilt, regret, she wasn't sure, at the thought of leaving. But she couldn't go. Not yet. There were questions that needed answers, and the house itself was the only one who could provide them. Chloé crossed the foyer, her feet carrying her instinctively toward the kitchen. It was a room she hadn't visited since her arrival, one that had been filled with so many memories of family dinners, of her mother bustling about in one of her bizarre, colorful outfits, humming to herself as she prepared meals that were always just a bit too experimental. When she pushed open the door, the kitchen looked as though it had been frozen in time. The old stove, a relic from another era, stood at the far end of the room, its surface stained with years of use. The countertops were cluttered with pots and pans, long forgotten, and the large wooden table in the center of the room was covered with a fine layer of dust. The air smelled stale, like the room hadn't been used in months, maybe years. A single plate sat on the table, still crusted with the remains of a long-forgotten meal, and the faint scent of something sour clung to the air, making her stomach churn. Chloé moved through the room slowly, her fingers trailing over the surfaces, leaving smudges in the dust. A framed photograph on the wall caught her eye. It was of her parents, standing in the garden just outside the house, her mother's arm draped over her father's shoulders. They were smiling, but the smile didn't reach her father's eyes, much like that last smile he had given her. It was as if even then, he had known what was coming. The photograph stirred something deep in Chloé, a faint ache in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She turned away from it, unwilling to let the memories drag her under. She had spent so long avoiding them, burying them beneath layers of indifference. But here, in this house, they threatened to resurface, to overwhelm her. A sudden sound snapped her from her thoughts. It was faint at first, like a low hum, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating through the walls. Chloé's heart began to race as the noise filled the air, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the house. She pressed her palms flat against the wall, feeling the vibration in her bones, the sound wrapping around her like a living thing. Her feet moved before she could stop herself, carrying her out of the kitchen and back into the foyer. The pulse followed her, growing stronger, more insistent. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence, a force that seemed to be pulling her deeper into the house. Her chest tightened with fear, but she couldn't stop moving, couldn't turn back. The mirror. It stood in the same corner of her father's study, exactly where she had found it the night before. Chloé stared at it from the doorway, her breath shallow as the pulse in the air seemed to converge on the glass, its surface rippling ever so slightly. The carved frame glistened in the pale light, its dark wood twisting and spiraling in strange, unnatural patterns as though it were alive. She stepped into the study, her eyes locked on the mirror. The pulse grew louder, more rhythmic, in time with her own heartbeat. Chloé felt drawn to the glass, her feet moving of their own accord, carrying her closer and closer until she was standing directly in front of it. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and ghostly in the dim light. But something was wrong. The image in the mirror felt off. It wasn't just the way her hair seemed to hang at an odd angle or the slight blur around the edges of her reflection. It was the eyes. Her reflection's eyes were darker than they should have been, too deep, like black pools that swallowed the light whole. Chloé's stomach lurched, but she couldn't look away. The pulse thrummed louder now, and as she stared into the mirror, the glass seemed to ripple once more. For a split second, she saw something behind her reflection, a shape, a figure standing in the shadows just out of view. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned back to the mirror, but her reflection was normal again. Just her, staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. Chloé's fingers twitched, hovering near the glass, as if some invisible force was urging her to touch it. The surface rippled again, faint but unmistakable, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Her hand moved on its own, fingertips brushing against the cold glass. The moment her skin made contact, the pulse stopped. Everything went still. The house, the air, her own breath, all of it frozen in place. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hang in limbo, suspended in a terrible, suffocating silence. Then, without warning, the glass began to pull. Chloe's eyes widened in horror as her hand was yanked forward, her fingers sinking into the mirror as though the glass had turned to liquid. She tried to pull back, but it was too late. The force was too strong. Her arm was swallowed up to the elbow, and before she could scream, her entire body was being dragged into the mirror. She stumbled forward, her body colliding with the glass, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, like thick, heavy water, pulling her deeper, faster. The reflection of the study around her began to blur, the walls distorting, stretching, and then, just like that, everything went black. When Chloe opened her eyes, she was no longer in her father's study. The room around her was strange, familiar yet distorted. It was the study, but not as she had known it. The walls seemed taller, the furniture warped, and the air was thick with a strange, unnatural glow. Everything was cast in an eerie, muted light, as though she were seeing the world through a pane of fogged glass. And then she saw it. Standing in the corner of the room, where the mirror had once been, was a figure. A girl, about her age, with dark hair and deep, hollow eyes that glistened with something far too ancient to belong to a human. Mina. The entity stared at her with a gaze so intense it made Chloe's skin crawl. She tried to move, to scream, but her body was frozen, trapped in the mirror world, her reflection left behind. Mina smiled. The house had her now, and it wasn't going to let her go. Chapter 4. Shadows Behind the Glass. The house was different without Chloe, or perhaps it was the same, and Mina had simply grown accustomed to the way the rooms felt quieter, heavier. The air was thick with a strange tension, like a storm gathering far in the distance but never quite breaking. Mina moved through the halls of Harper House, her steps measured and deliberate, her gaze sweeping over the familiar rooms that now felt as foreign as if she were walking through someone else's home. She had noticed the change as soon as she woke. Chloe's room was empty, the bed made, but the energy, the presence that her sister had carried with her, was gone, as if it had been drained from the space overnight. The sun was a pale ghost, struggling to break through the thick layer of mist that had settled over the estate, casting everything in a dim, washed-out glow. Even the shadows seemed listless, like they too had grown weary of waiting. Mina hadn't thought much of it at first. Chloe had been distant since her return, locked in her own world of grief and memories, and Mina hadn't pressed her. They had drifted apart long before their father's death, and the years of separation had created an invisible barrier between them that neither of them seemed willing or able to cross. So Mina had let her be, assuming that her sister needed space, time to process the weight of their shared loss in her own way. But now, as Mina stood in the foyer, gazing up at the grand staircase that wound its way toward the second floor, a cold knot of unease twisted in her gut. The house felt emptier than it should. It wasn't just Chloe's absence. There was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. The silence was too thick, too oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. Her hand brushed the banister as she ascended the stairs, her footsteps echoing faintly in the vast space. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the once vibrant patterns faded and cracked with age. She had spent so much of her childhood running up and down these stairs, the house alive with the sounds of laughter and life. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now, as if they had happened in another world entirely. At the top of the stairs, Mina hesitated, her gaze lingering on the door to Chloe's room. The door was ajar, the faintest sliver of light slipping through the crack. She pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was just as she had left it. The bed was neatly made, the covers undisturbed. The curtains were half drawn, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. Chloe's belongings were still scattered across the room. Her suitcase, half unpacked, sat by the closet. A few books lay open on the desk, their pages crinkled and worn. But the room felt vacant. hollow. Mina's eyes fell on the mirror that stood in the corner. It was an old, ornate thing, the kind of piece that had probably been in the family for generations. The frame was dark wood, intricately carved with twisting patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if she stared at them too long. She had never liked it as a child. There had always been something unsettling about the way it reflected the room, as though it were watching her from the other side of the glass. She approached the mirror slowly, her heart beating a little faster as she neared it. There was nothing remarkable about her reflection, just her, standing in Chloe's room, the same pale light casting shadows across her face. But something felt off. She couldn't explain it, couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became that something was watching her from the other side. Mina blinked, breaking the gaze, and stepped back. The house groaned softly, the old wood shifting and settling as it always did. But the sound made her flinch. Her nerves were frayed, worn thin by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to have taken root in the walls. She needed air, needed to get out of this room, this house. She turned on her heel, leaving Chloe's room behind, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was cold when she entered, the tile floor icy against her bare feet. The windows were fogged over, the glass streaked with condensation that blurred the view of the garden beyond. She stood by the sink, staring out at the tangled mess of weeds and overgrown hedges that had once been her mother's pride and joy. Her mother. Mina hadn't seen her that morning either, but that was nothing new. Claire had always been different, even before their father's death. Eccentric, people called her, though Mina knew it went deeper than that. There had always been something wild in their mother's eyes, something untamed and unpredictable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. But since the funeral, she had retreated even further into herself, spending most of her time locked away in her room or wandering the house aimlessly, her mind lost in places Mina couldn't follow. Mina's gaze drifted back to the mirror in the hallway. It was smaller than the one in Chloe's room, but the design was similar. Same dark wood, same twisting patterns that seemed to writhe and shift if you looked too closely. The light from the kitchen reflected faintly in the glass, casting strange, distorted shadows across the floor. For a moment, Mina thought she saw movement, a flicker of something, just out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned to look, the hallway was empty. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still. It felt like a predator lying in wait, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. She needed to find her mother, to make sure she was okay. Leaving the kitchen behind, Mina moved through the house with purpose, her bare feet making little noise on the cold wooden floors. The door to her mother's room was closed, as it so often was, but Mina hesitated before knocking. She didn't want to disturb her if she was in one of her moods, but the growing sense of unease gnawed at her, urging her forward. She raised her hand and knocked softly. No response. Mina knocked again, louder this time. But the only sound was the faint creaking of the house as it shifted in the wind. Her throat tightened with anxiety. She turned the knob slowly, the old door groaning as it swung open. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight. A faint smell of lavender and dust filled the air, mixing with the cold scent of something metallic that lingered beneath. Mina stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Her mother's bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and twisted, as though someone had been tossing and turning in the night. The room felt abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. Mina's heart raced as she scanned the room, her eyes drawn to the dresser in the corner. Her mother's mirror, smaller, rounder than the others, but made of the same dark, twisted wood, sat on top of it. The surface was dusty, the reflection dim and warped in the faint light. The pulse started again, that same low hum she had felt in Chloe's room, vibrating through the walls, through her bones. Mina's breath hitched, and she took a step back, her gaze flicking to the mirror. The glass rippled faintly, like a drop of water had been placed in the center, sending small waves outward. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection was delayed, like it wasn't quite keeping up with her movements. The pulse grew louder, more insistent, and Mina's heartbeat quickened in response. Her reflection's eyes were dark, too dark, just like in Chloe's mirror. But this time, Mina saw it, the figure behind her. A shape, shadowy and indistinct, standing just outside the frame of the mirror, watching. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. No one was there. The room was empty, silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Mina's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. She felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck, a deep, primal fear clawing at the edges of her mind. She had to get out. Mina turned and fled the room, slamming the door shut behind her. The house was watching her. She could feel it. The mirrors were watching. Every step she took echoed through the halls, the pulse growing louder, more persistent, until it was all she could hear. As she stumbled back into the foyer, Mina's eyes locked onto the large, ornate mirror by the front door. The frame seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light, the glass rippling like water. Her reflection stared back at her, its eyes too dark, too deep, like two black holes that swallowed everything around them. And then, in a single, terrible moment, Mina saw her reflection smile. The smile wasn't hers. It didn't belong to her. It belonged to something else, something watching her from behind the glass. Mina's blood ran cold, her legs trembling as she backed away from the mirror. The house was awake now, fully awake, and it had her in its sights. The pulse throbbed in her ears, louder and louder, until she could barely hear her own thoughts over the sound of it. The house was alive. The mirrors were alive, and something was coming for her. With a final, panicked glance at her distorted reflection, Mina turned and fled deeper into the house, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She wasn't alone in Harper House. Not anymore. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. The rain had come in a steady, relentless downpour, turning the grounds of Harper House into a sea of mud and water. The skies above were heavy with thick clouds, the sun completely hidden behind the storm. Everything outside seemed to be swallowed by the gray veil, the once grand estate now a shadow of its former self, sinking under the weight of the rain. Inside, the air was stagnant, filled with the scent of damp wood and musty wallpaper. Every room seemed darker than it should have been, as though the storm outside had seeped into the house itself, dulling the light and muffling the sounds. The hum, the pulsing presence that Mina had felt ever since Chloé disappeared, had not left her. If anything, it had grown stronger. The mirrors had become an ever-present source of unease. They lined the halls and rooms like silent sentinels, watching with their warped glass and distorted reflections. Each time Mina passed one, her reflection seemed a little off, a little slower, as though it lagged just behind her movements, as if it had to think before copying her. The pulse had grown worse after the incident in her mother's room. Whatever she had felt there, whatever had been watching her, seemed to have followed her, slipping through the walls, creeping through the shadows. She could no longer shake the sensation of being observed from every corner, every surface. The mirrors seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, catching the faintest flickers of motion just outside her field of vision. Mina found herself walking the halls aimlessly, unable to sit still. The house was changing around her. She was sure of it. The layout that had once been so familiar, so deeply ingrained in her childhood memories, felt foreign now, alien. Rooms appeared smaller than they had been the day before. Corridors seemed to stretch longer, twisting into unfamiliar directions. She would find herself walking down the same hallway more than once, only to end up in a completely different part of the house than she had intended. The sense of disorientation was growing stronger. It was as if the house was trying to confuse her, to keep her from finding something. Or maybe it was leading her somewhere. She hadn't seen Claire. Her mother had locked herself away, as she often did, retreating into her own world, leaving Mina alone with the suffocating presence of the house. Chloe's absence gnawed at her, a constant ache at the back of her mind. She hadn't left. Mina knew that. She was still here, somewhere, but finding her felt like trying to find a needle in a haystack. No, worse than that. It felt like trying to find someone who had stepped into another world entirely. Mina stopped in front of the grand mirror in the foyer, the one she had fled from days earlier. The rain outside had streaked the window panes with water, casting rippling patterns of light and shadow on the walls. The mirror reflected the foyer in perfect stillness, the heavy wooden furniture, the staircase winding up toward the second floor. And her reflection was there, of course, but it was wrong. Mina stood perfectly still, watching the mirror, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection stared back, unblinking. She raised her hand slowly, as though testing some invisible boundary, and watched as her reflection did the same. But it was delayed, just by a fraction of a second, just enough to unsettle her. Her reflection's eyes were darker than they should have been, deep pools of shadow that swallowed the light. She stepped closer to the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The surface of the glass seemed to ripple slightly, as though the reflection wasn't quite solid. She raised her other hand, pressing her fingertips to the cool surface. A soft hum reverberated through her fingertips, a low, steady vibration that matched the pulsing sensation that had been following her. The glass was cold, but not in the way a normal mirror would be. It was the cold of something living, something that had no warmth of its own. Mina's pulse quickened as she leaned closer, her nose almost touching the glass. The reflection stared back, the dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. She felt the strange pull, the same force she had felt in her mother's room, in Chloe's room. The glass seemed to shift, the patterns in the frame writhing, twisting into something almost organic. She yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. The house creaked in response, the sound deep and resonant, as though it was alive, reacting to her fear. Mina's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she backed away, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The reflection had returned to normal, but the sensation of something watching her, something lurking just beneath the surface of the glass, didn't leave. She turned and fled, her feet carrying her down the hallway without any sense of direction. The pulse followed her, growing louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was alive with it now, thrumming with the same malevolent energy that had taken hold of the mirrors. The hallway twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the house. The wallpaper peeled in places, revealing dark, moldy patches beneath, and the floors creaked ominously with each step. The further she went, the more distorted her surroundings became. The walls seemed to close in on her, the ceilings pressing down, the shadows growing longer, darker. She reached the end of the hall, finding herself standing in front of a door she hadn't seen before. It was an old door, the wood warped and cracked with age. The brass doorknob was tarnished, the surface dull and pitted. She hesitated, her hand hovering just above the knob. Something about this door felt wrong, like it shouldn't have been there. But the pulse had drawn her here, tugging at her like an invisible thread, and she couldn't stop herself from reaching out, from turning the knob and pushing the door open. The room beyond was dark, the air thick and heavy. The scent of dampness and decay hit her immediately, making her stomach churn. She stepped inside, her eyes straining to adjust to the gloom. The only light came from a small, narrow window high on the far wall, through which the faintest sliver of gray daylight filtered in. The walls were lined with mirrors, not just a few, but dozens of them, each one different, yet all sharing the same strange, distorted quality. The frames were a mix of styles, some ornate and gilded, others plain and cracked with age. The glass in each mirror shimmered faintly, as though it were liquid, alive. They all faced the center of the room, reflecting each other in an endless, dizzying pattern. Mina's breath caught in her throat as she stepped further into the room. Her reflection multiplied endlessly in the mirrors, each one slightly off, slightly wrong. She moved to the center of the room, her footsteps silent on the cold stone floor, and turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the endless reflections. And then she saw it. In one of the mirrors, buried deep in the reflections, was a figure. It wasn't her. The figure stood just behind her reflection, its shape dark and indistinct. She froze, her pulse racing as her eyes locked onto it. It was watching her, its eyes gleaming with a strange, cold light. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the room behind her was empty. Nothing but shadows. She turned back to the mirror, but the figure was still there, closer now, its outline becoming clearer. It was tall, its form twisted and unnatural, like a shadow that had taken on a life of its own. Its eyes were the only thing that stood out, two black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Mina's breath hitched as she took a step back, her body trembling. The figure moved, stepping forward in the reflection, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was studying her, waiting for something. She turned and fled. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The pulse was everywhere now, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through her bones. She could feel the presence behind her, following her, its cold eyes locked onto her back. The mirrors watched her as she passed, their reflections shifting and twisting, their surfaces rippling like water. She didn't dare look at them, didn't dare slow down. She could feel the house closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing darker. Mina reached the grand staircase, her feet stumbling over the steps as she descended. The pulse was deafening now, a low, steady thrum that filled her entire being. She could feel it in her chest, in her head, in her hands. It was inside her, wrapping around her like a vice, squeezing the air from her lungs. She reached the foyer, her legs trembling beneath her. The large mirror by the front door loomed ahead, its surface dark and rippling. Her reflection stood there, staring back at her, its eyes black as coal. And then it smiled, the same terrible, twisted smile that wasn't hers. Mina's vision blurred as the pulse overtook her. The house, the mirrors, the shadows. It was all too much. She sank to her knees, her body shaking, the pulse drowning out everything, until all that was left was darkness. And in that darkness, the figure waited. It was always watching, and it was coming. Chapter 6: The Veil of Shadows. Mina awoke on the cold floor of the foyer, her body stiff and her mind shrouded in fog. The house was silent now, the pulse that had throbbed in her ears gradually fading to a low hum, like the last notes of a haunting melody. The faint light from the grimy windows cast distorted shadows across the room, elongating the furniture and stretching the darkness into shapes that danced in the corners of her vision. She pushed herself up, wincing as the chill of the floor seeped through her clothes. Her heart raced as she remembered the reflection, the figure, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. The echoes of fear still lingered in her veins, a residual tremor that made her skin crawl. Mina took a shaky breath, grounding herself against the wall for support. The air felt heavy, thick with a tension that pressed down on her chest. It was as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. Her gaze flicked to the large mirror by the front door, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. The reflection stared back, her features slightly off, as though the mirror had been warped by something unseen. She couldn't look at it, not after what she had seen. She needed to find Chloé. She needed to break this cycle of dread that had enveloped Harper House. Pushing away from the wall, Mina forced herself to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. The house loomed around her, every creak and groan a reminder of the shadows that lurked just out of sight. She needed to find her sister. That was the only thing that mattered. The hallway stretched before her, the familiar path now twisted in ways that made her heart pound. She hesitated at the foot of the staircase, memories flooding back of their childhood. The nights spent playing hide and seek, their laughter echoing through the halls. The sense of safety and comfort was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. Mina ascended the stairs slowly, her footsteps muffled by the carpet, each step amplifying her anxiety. As she reached the second floor, the house felt different, darker. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners, thickening like smoke. She turned towards Chloé's room, its door still slightly ajar, the remnants of light spilling out into the hallway. For a moment, she paused, staring at the door as if it were a threshold to another world, one she had no desire to enter alone. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, the light illuminating the space. The room was unchanged, yet it felt tainted by an unseen presence. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of forgotten dreams and unspoken fears. Chloé's belongings remained scattered across the room, untouched since her sister's disappearance. Mina crossed to the mirror in the corner, her pulse quickening as she neared it. The ornate frame felt alive under her fingertips, the wood warm and pulsing as if it were breathing. She hesitated, memories of the figure flooding her mind, but the urge to look was overpowering. With a deep breath, she peered into the glass. At first, she saw only her reflection, her dark hair tousled, eyes wide with fear. But as she continued to gaze, the surface shimmered, rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. The distortion began to coalesce, the edges of her reflection blurring until they melted into the darkness behind her. And there it was. The figure loomed in the background, its outline darker than the shadows surrounding it. It watched her with its hollow, obsidian eyes, a sinister glint shining in the depths of its gaze. Mina stumbled back, the terror rushing through her, but the figure remained, unfazed by her fear. The pulse returned, thrumming through her body, merging with her heartbeat. It reverberated in the glass, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the surface and pull the figure into her world. But she resisted, the instinct to flee overpowering the temptation to explore. Mina turned away, her breath coming in quick bursts, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get out, to find some semblance of safety within the walls of Harper House. She was not alone, and the thought of being trapped in a dance with that figure sent a chill down her spine. She stepped into the hallway, the shadows closing in around her as she moved towards the end of the corridor. Each step felt weighted, as if the house itself were trying to anchor her to the ground. The urge to run surged within her, but the oppressive atmosphere held her back, reminding her that escape was not an option. With a quick glance at the other doors lining the hall, she paused in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, nestled between the wall and a larger cabinet. The door was worn and cracked, the wood rough under her fingertips. Mina hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over her. But something within her compelled her to turn the knob. As it creaked open, the air that escaped felt charged, tinged with a sense of secrecy. The room beyond was dim, the only light filtering in through a small window covered in dust and grime. As she stepped inside, the walls were lined with more mirrors, some large, others small, each reflecting a distorted version of her. The space felt tight, suffocating, as though the mirrors were closing in around her. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and something else, something metallic that hung in the air, making her stomach churn. The reflections danced in the dim light, their images swirling and flickering as if alive. Mina moved deeper into the room, her heart racing, her pulse echoing in her ears. The mirrors seemed to draw her in, calling to her with a haunting allure. One mirror caught her eye, its surface shimmering with an unusual brilliance. She stepped closer, entranced by the way the light played upon the glass. As she peered into it, the reflection wavered, the edges softening until they melted away completely. And there she was. Or rather, there was a version of her, smiling, carefree, with an expression that radiated a twisted sense of joy. This reflection was brighter, lighter, almost vibrant compared to the darkness that engulfed the room. But there was something in those eyes, a flicker of something dark, something wrong. Mina recoiled, the pulse in her veins quickening. This was not her. It couldn't be. This version was taunting her, beckoning her closer with an unspoken promise of relief from the chaos that had consumed her life since her father's death. But even as she fought against the allure, the figure from the shadows crept into her peripheral vision. It was moving closer, edging into the space behind her reflection, its hollow eyes glinting with malicious intent. Mina stumbled back, gasping for air as the realization crashed over her. The mirrors weren't just reflections. They were gateways, portals that connected her to something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. The figure was slipping through the glass, inching closer with each passing moment. Panic surged within her, primal and all-consuming. She had to escape. She turned and fled the room, the mirrors whispering behind her, their voices melding into a cacophony of taunts and taunts, drowning out her thoughts. She raced down the hall, her heart pounding as she reached the staircase. The shadows stretched and clawed at her heels, the pulse thrumming louder in her ears, urging her to look back. But she couldn't. She couldn't afford to lose sight of the world outside, of the reality she had known before this nightmare began. As she descended the stairs, the grand foyer loomed below, its vastness swallowing her as she landed on the bottom step. But something was wrong. The mirrors lining the walls had shifted. They reflected the same distorted hallway she had just left, but something darker lurked behind the glass. She paused, dread pooling in her stomach as she noticed the absence of light. The sun had disappeared entirely, leaving only the oppressive gloom that shrouded the house. The windows were black, void of any hint of the outside world. She was cut off, trapped in this place. And then she saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the foyer, just outside the reach of the mirrors, its outline flickering like a candle in the wind. It was more defined now, the dark edges sharpening into something tangible, something that stirred the air with an unnatural energy. It was waiting, watching, its presence heavy and suffocating. Mina's heart raced, and she backed away, feeling the oppressive weight of the house closing in around her. She was caught in a web of shadows, the walls pressing tighter with each breath. The figure moved forward, its form bending and twisting, gliding through the space between the mirrors, closing the distance. Mina turned to flee, racing toward the kitchen, desperate to escape the encroaching darkness. She burst through the doorway, the cold tile of the kitchen floor sending a shock through her feet as she skidded to a stop. The familiar space was transformed, the furniture shrouded in deep shadows that whispered secrets. Her eyes darted to the windows, but the rain was still pouring, heavy and relentless, washing away the last remnants of light. There was no escape. She was trapped, caught in the web of the house's dark magic. In the far corner, the mirror hung low, its surface a dark abyss. Mina felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, the same irresistible draw that had taken her into the other rooms. It whispered to her, a low hum that resonated deep within her bones. Fighting against the urge to step closer, Mina turned away, searching for something, anything, to use as a weapon against the darkness. She rifled through the drawers, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with utensils and dishes. The sensation of being watched clung to her, thickening the air until she felt suffocated. As she turned back, the figure was there, its form more defined than ever, eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It stepped forward, and with it, the shadows deepened, enveloping the room in a chilling embrace. Mina's heart raced as she grabbed a heavy frying pan from the counter, the weight comforting in her hands. The figure paused, as if assessing her, its smile widening into a grotesque expression that sent a shiver down her spine. She raised the pan, a desperate attempt to ward off the encroaching darkness. The shadows danced around her, twisting and writhing, and for a moment, she felt powerful. But the figure laughed, a soundless, echoing cackle that reverberated through the room, shaking the very foundation of the house. The mirrors flickered, the glass rippling like water disturbed, reflecting endless versions of her terror. Mina took a step back, heart racing as she realized the futility of her actions. The darkness was too deep, too overwhelming, and it was drawing closer. She had to find a way to break this cycle, to reach Chloé, to free her family from the grip of this malevolent force. But the shadows pressed in around her, the figure looming larger as it stepped into the light of the kitchen, its intentions dark and unyielding. In that moment, Mina understood that this was not just a fight for her own survival. It was a battle for her sister's life, for her mother's sanity, and for the very soul of Harper House itself. With one final, defiant breath, she charged forward, ready to face the shadows that threatened to swallow her whole. Chapter 7. The Convergence of Shadows. The frying pan felt heavy in Mina's hands as she charged toward the figure. Adrenaline surged through her veins, fueling her desperation to reclaim her sister and confront the darkness, threatening to engulf them all. The shadows loomed larger, swirling around her, whispering taunts that sent a chill down her spine. The kitchen transformed into a battleground, the familiar surroundings now a distorted nightmare. Every surface seemed to warp and twist, the shadows elongating and retreating as if they were alive, testing her resolve. She could feel the weight of the malevolent energy pressing down, eager to devour her spirit. The figure, a grotesque parody of her own self, advanced slowly, its movement gliding across the floor with an unnatural grace. The embers in its eyes flickered like dying stars, and with every step, the atmosphere thickened, an almost tangible force that pulled at her breath. Mina's heart raced, and she tightened her grip on the frying pan, a frail weapon against the encroaching darkness. With a primal scream that echoed in her mind, she swung the pan toward the figure. It connected with a resounding clang, sending a jolt through her arm. But instead of collapsing, the figure shimmered, as if the blow had passed through a layer of mist. It grinned wider, the shadows flickering around it, their presence growing more chaotic, alive. Mina staggered back, the dread creeping in as the figure regained its composure. It leaned forward, its features distorting in the flickering light, becoming an amalgamation of faces. Her father, her mother, her sister, each one twisting in anguish, reflecting the pain that had festered in Harper House. She gasped, horror flooding her senses. This was not just an entity. It was a manifestation of their collective sorrow, a specter that fed on their grief and despair. The realization sent waves of fear through her. The darkness sought to shatter their family, to plunge them into an abyss of pain. Mina turned to flee, but the figure followed, its movements silent and fluid, gliding closer with every passing second. She dashed through the kitchen door and into the living room, the shadows trailing behind her like a vengeful tide. The room was a disarray of memories, photographs scattered across the coffee table, their frames askew, each image a frozen moment in time. Mina's heart clenched as she recognized snapshots of happier days, smiles, laughter, moments when their family had felt whole. But those images were now tainted, the shadows creeping into the corners of the frames, distorting the joyous expressions into masks of despair. Driven by instinct, she swept the photographs aside, creating a path through the clutter, desperately searching for a way to break free of the oppressive gloom. The shadows writhed, creeping across the floor and curling up the walls, trying to ensnare her in their grasp. In her frantic search, she noticed a glimmer on the mantel, a small glass orb that had once belonged to her mother, a trinket filled with swirling colors. It caught the dim light, refracting it into rainbows that danced across the walls. As she reached for it, a voice whispered through the air, a soft caress that beckoned her closer. The figure lingered at the edge of the room, its gaze fixed on the orb with a hungry glint in its eyes. It recognized the power of the glass, its light a weapon against the encroaching darkness. With trembling hands, Mina seized the orb, its cool surface grounding her amid the chaos. The shadows recoiled, and for a brief moment, she felt an overwhelming surge of hope. The orb pulsed gently, vibrant colors swirling inside as if awakening from a long slumber. The figure's expression twisted into fury, the shadows thrashing violently, trying to drown her in their depths. But Mina held her ground, raising the orb high, feeling the energy within it thrumming to life. The light pierced through the gloom, illuminating the room and pushing back the darkness that clawed at her heels. As the shadows receded, the figure hissed, its form flickering as it struggled against the radiant light. It lunged forward, but Mina met its advance with the orb, the light erupting in a brilliant flare. The room flooded with color, the shadows retreating further until they were mere wisps in the corners, desperate to escape the light's embrace. But even as she fought back, Mina understood that the figure was not just a physical threat. It was a representation of their family's grief, anger, and loss. The light could push it away for a moment, but it would not banish the darkness forever. She needed to confront the pain it embodied, to find a way to free her family from its grip. As the shadows continued to withdraw, Mina focused on the orb, drawing strength from its light. She closed her eyes, allowing memories to flood her mind. Her father's laughter, her mother's gentle touch, the bond she shared with Chloé. She envisioned their family as it had once been, whole and unbroken. The light pulsed in response, growing brighter, illuminating the entire room in a kaleidoscope of color. The figure shrieked, its form contorting as it was forced back by the radiant energy. It was a battle of wills, the light against the darkness. But just as Mina felt the tide turning, a flicker of doubt crept in. What if the darkness was stronger than her resolve? What if her memories couldn't hold against the weight of grief that had settled over their lives? The shadows writhed, sensing her hesitation, and for a moment, she felt the light dim. In that moment of uncertainty, the figure lunged, darkness swirling around it, attempting to envelop her in its grip. Mina's heart raced as she fought against the pull, the orb flickering dangerously in her grasp. But then, she remembered Chloé. Images of her sister flooded her mind, the bond they had shared despite the chaos. Chloé's laughter echoed in her thoughts, the moments they had spent together as children, building forts and sharing secrets. Those memories ignited a fire within her, a fierce determination to protect the one person who mattered most. With renewed resolve, Mina focused on the orb, channeling all her love, all her hope, into its core. The light surged, radiating warmth and strength, filling the room with brilliance. She opened her eyes, locking onto the figure, and in that moment, the shadows shrank back, the figure's form beginning to dissipate. The air crackled with energy as the shadows battled against the light, a tempest of color and darkness colliding in a violent dance. Mina stood firm, drawing on every ounce of strength, feeling the warmth of the orb enveloping her in a protective embrace. The figure faltered, its grotesque visage twisting in agony, but it wasn't just the light that forced it back. It was her connection to her family, the love that transcended the grief that had haunted them for so long. As the orb glowed brighter, a pulse of energy erupted from it, washing over the room and breaking the hold the shadows had on her. The figure shrieked, its form dissolving into mist as the light engulfed it, chasing away the darkness that had sought to tear her family apart. Mina gasped as the room exploded in color, the shadows evaporating like fog in the sun. The orb's light illuminated every corner, filling the space with warmth and hope. The kitchen transformed back into a familiar haven, the darkness receding to reveal the beauty hidden beneath. But even as she triumphed, Mina understood the darkness would not disappear completely. It was a part of them, a shadow that lingered in the corners of their hearts. Yet in that moment, she felt a shift, a glimmer of hope that perhaps they could face it together as a family. She clutched the orb tightly, feeling its warmth seep into her skin. As she turned to leave the kitchen, her heart swelled with determination. She had fought the darkness and emerged victorious, but now she needed to find Chloé. With the light guiding her, Mina raced through the living room and up the stairs, her resolve unwavering. She had faced the figure, but now she needed to confront the truth of their family's pain and bring her sister back from the edge of despair. As she reached the second floor, the familiar hallway stretched before her, but the atmosphere felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of the shadows had lifted. The doors loomed around her, each one a doorway to memories that had shaped their lives. With purpose, she moved toward Chloé's room, the light from the orb illuminating her path. But as she approached the door, a chill washed over her. The shadows had not disappeared entirely. They lingered, waiting for an opportunity to return. Mina paused, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She had faced the darkness once, but she needed to be ready for what lay ahead. The orb pulsed softly in her grip, reminding her of the strength she carried within. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before pushing the door open. The room was bathed in a warm glow, the remnants of sunlight filtering through the window. But something felt off, a stillness hanging in the air like a harbinger of the unknown. Inside, the mirror stood, its surface shimmering with the last remnants of the figure's essence. Chloé was nowhere to be seen. The bed was untouched, the pillows perfectly fluffed, but the emptiness was palpable, echoing the void that had settled in her heart. Mina stepped inside, her heart pounding as she moved closer to the mirror, the silvery light washing over her like a gentle wave. The reflective surface shimmered with an otherworldly glow, pulling her gaze deeper into its depths. As she peered into the glass, she felt as though she was looking not just at her own reflection, but into another realm entirely, a space filled with dreams and nightmares, where the boundaries of reality blurred. The mirror was no longer merely a piece of furniture. It had transformed into a portal, a gateway to the shadows that loomed beyond. Mina could feel the energy swirling within it, a vortex of emotions, thoughts, and echoes of her family's past. The whispers grew louder, thrumming in her ears like a distant song, drawing her closer with an almost magnetic force. As she stood there, entranced, the world around her began to fade. The familiar contours of the room shifted, dissolving into a swirling mass of colors and shapes. The light from the orb flickered, struggling to penetrate the dense fog that enveloped her. But Mina pushed through, fueled by the desire to find Chloé and bring her back from the edge of despair. The fog parted as she took a step forward, revealing a landscape unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a realm caught between twilight and night, where the sky shimmered with an array of stars, but a heavy darkness loomed at its edges. Ethereal trees with gnarled branches stretched high into the air, their leaves glimmering like shards of glass, creating an illusion of beauty that belied the danger lurking within. Mina moved cautiously, each footfall echoing in the stillness. The air was thick, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She felt the shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let fear take hold. Instead, she concentrated on the connection to Chloé, feeling her sister's presence like a beacon in the darkness. As she ventured deeper into this haunting realm, the shadows began to dance around her, swirling with an almost sentient awareness. They whispered in soft tones, a cacophony of voices intertwined, taunting her with fragmented memories of her family. Images flickered before her eyes, her father's laughter, their mother's gentle embrace, Chloé's playful smile. Each memory was tinged with sorrow, a reminder of the pain they had endured since their father's passing. Determined not to succumb to despair, Mina pressed on, the orb's light flickering brightly in her grasp. She moved through the thick mists that coiled around her, each step bringing her closer to the heart of the darkness. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, haunting voice that resonated deep within her. It was the voice of the figure, echoing her fears, reminding her of the struggles they had faced as a family. "Come home, Mina. You cannot escape the truth," it seemed to say, and the shadows writhed around her, eager to pull her into their embrace. But Mina refused to be swayed. With every ounce of strength she possessed, she focused on the light emanating from the orb, the warmth radiating through her fingers. She envisioned Chloé, their bond unbreakable, and called out silently to her sister, willing her to hold on. Then, as if the realm itself responded to her determination, the landscape shifted again. The mists parted, revealing a path lined with shimmering stones that led to a clearing ahead. Hope surged within her as she rushed forward, the orb illuminating her way, casting shadows that danced behind her. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface smooth and reflective. Mina approached cautiously, her heart racing as she felt the familiar energy radiating from it. This mirror pulsed with a deeper, darker essence, an echo of the figure that had haunted her family, a remnant of their pain. As she stepped closer, she saw her own reflection staring back at her, but there was something off about it. The image rippled, morphing into a distorted version of herself, eyes hollow and face twisted with anguish. Mina recoiled, the sense of dread flooding back as the figure within the mirror raised its hand, reaching out as if trying to escape. For a moment, they were locked in a silent standoff, a battle of wills between light and dark. The orb in Mina's hand flickered uncertainly, sensing the pull of the darkness within the mirror. But she drew upon the memories of love and laughter, the bond she shared with Chloé, and focused on the warmth radiating from her heart. The figure in the mirror recoiled, shadows spilling from its form as Mina's resolve strengthened. She raised the orb high, letting its light flood the clearing, illuminating every corner with brilliance. The air crackled with energy, the shadows retreating as they fought against the purity of the light. In that moment of clarity, she felt a connection to the figure, an understanding of the pain that had birthed it. It was not just a manifestation of evil. It was a reflection of her family's grief, their unprocessed sorrow, and unresolved anger. The realization hit her like a wave, and she understood that to truly confront the darkness, she needed to embrace the pain they had all been avoiding. Mina stepped forward, her heart open, and pressed her palm against the mirror's surface. The orb pulsed in response, a warm light spreading through her arm and into the glass. The shadows writhed violently, but she stood her ground, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. In an instant, the mirror shattered, the shards exploding outward in a cascade of light and darkness. The figure screamed, its form splintering as the light engulfed it, illuminating the clearing with a dazzling brilliance. Mina closed her eyes against the radiance, feeling the warmth wrap around her like a protective embrace. When she opened her eyes, the clearing was transformed. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by vibrant colors and the sweet scent of blooming flowers. The weight of grief that had burdened her heart lightened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she breathed freely. But the battle was not over. As the last remnants of darkness evaporated, Mina felt a flicker of anxiety. Chloé was still out there, and the journey was far from finished. With renewed determination, she turned back toward the path, the orb still glowing brightly in her hand. Mina pressed onward, the landscape shifting around her, leading her deeper into the heart of this strange world. She could feel Chloé's presence drawing closer, the bond between them undeniable. Each step felt lighter, infused with hope as the remnants of the darkness faded away. As she ventured deeper, the shadows began to stir again, lingering at the edges, but they were different now, less malevolent and more watchful. They twisted and turned, reflecting the emotions that coursed through her, both the joy of love and the sorrow of loss. The understanding that these shadows were a part of her, part of their family's story, gave her strength. With determination burning in her chest, she pressed on, the orb illuminating her path as she followed the trail of light that connected her to Chloé. The clearing ahead pulsed with energy, and she could sense her sister waiting for her, just beyond the horizon. Mina raced toward the glow, feeling the air shift around her, a blend of anticipation and trepidation. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the shadows that had threatened to tear them apart and bring her sister back into the light. With each step, she felt the power of their connection growing stronger, the love that transcended darkness, binding them together. The orb pulsed brighter with every heartbeat, guiding her through the shadows, toward the hope that awaited just beyond the veil. Finally, she reached the edge of the clearing, the vibrant light spilling out in waves, illuminating the darkness that lingered behind her. In that moment, she knew that she was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her sister, for their family, and for the chance to heal the wounds that had haunted them for so long. Mina stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever awaited her, the bond with Chloé anchoring her in the chaos. They would confront the darkness together, and this time, it would not stand a chance. Chapter 8. Reflections of Truth. Mina stood before the mirror, its surface rippling like a disturbed pond, reflecting fragments of her own image mingled with flickers of darkness. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing against her chest, as if the house itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The orb pulsed gently in her grasp, its light illuminating the room and casting soft glows on the walls. But the shadows still lingered, curling like smoke around her feet. As she stepped closer, the mirror drew her in, an alluring invitation that sent shivers down her spine. It was a portal to another world, a threshold that promised both danger and answers. Chloé was somewhere on the other side, and Mina was determined to bring her back. With a hesitant hand, she reached toward the mirror, her fingers brushing the cool surface. The sensation sent a jolt through her, a rush of memories flooding her mind. The warmth of her sister's laughter, the way Chloé would twirl in the sunlight, her hair dancing like fire. Those memories, vivid and alive, ignited a fire within Mina, compelling her to push further. As her palm made contact with the glass, the world around her wavered, the familiar contours of Chloé's room blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors. She felt herself being pulled forward, the boundaries of reality dissolving as she stepped into the mirror. Mina emerged in a twilight realm, the air thick with an ethereal mist. The ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding, a silvery surface that shimmered with each step. It felt unreal, almost dreamlike, but the urgency of her mission propelled her onward. She glanced around, searching for any sign of Chloé. The landscape stretched out before her, a surreal blend of familiar and foreign. Ethereal trees twisted toward a sky painted in hues of deep blue and indigo, their leaves glimmering like stars. A low mist curled around the trunks, weaving through the branches, shrouding everything in a mysterious veil. The haunting beauty of this world was both captivating and unsettling. As she moved forward, shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, darting in and out of sight. They pulsed with a life of their own, whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. Mina's heart raced. She could feel the presence of the figure lurking nearby, waiting to ensnare her in its grasp once more. Determined not to succumb to fear, she tightened her grip on the orb, its light guiding her through the dimness. The deeper she ventured into this realm, the more she felt the essence of Chloé intertwined with the atmosphere, like a faint melody echoing in the distance. Each step brought her closer to her sister, but also deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, the landscape shifted, revealing a clearing ahead. A sense of urgency surged through Mina as she rushed forward, the orb illuminating the path before her. In the center of the clearing stood a massive structure, a twisted amalgamation of wood and glass, the walls covered in dark vines that writhed as if alive. The mirrors that adorned its surface were cracked and jagged, reflecting distorted images of the world around her. Mina approached the structure, drawn by an inexplicable force. She could sense Chloé within, the connection between them pulling her closer. As she stepped inside, the air grew colder, the shadows thickening around her. The walls echoed with faint whispers, fragments of thoughts that brushed against her mind, teasing her with glimpses of the past. In the dim light, Mina caught sight of a figure in the distance, illuminated by a soft glow. It moved gracefully, its silhouette reminiscent of Chloé. Her heart leaped at the sight, but an unsettling feeling crept in. What if it was another deception, another manifestation of the darkness? She hesitated, doubt gnawing at her resolve, but the connection was undeniable. She needed to reach her sister, to break through the barriers that separated them. Summoning her courage, Mina called out silently, focusing on the love she held for Chloé, willing the light within her to bridge the gap between them. As she moved closer, the figure turned, and Mina's breath caught in her throat. It was Chloé, but she looked different. Her face was pale, and her eyes held a haunted glimmer that sent a chill down Mina's spine. Chloé stood before a large mirror embedded in the wall, her gaze fixed on the fractured surface, entranced by its shimmering depths. Mina felt a wave of despair wash over her. Chloé was trapped, ensnared by the same darkness that had haunted their family. She reached out, desperate to bridge the distance between them, but the shadows shifted, swirling around Chloé, blocking her path. With determination igniting within her, Mina approached, the orb pulsating fiercely in her grasp. She could feel the darkness pressing in, trying to isolate her sister, but she refused to let it win. The love they shared was stronger than any shadow, and she would fight for Chloé, no matter the cost. As she neared, the air crackled with energy, the shadows recoiling from the light of the orb. Mina extended her arm, reaching for Chloé. The moment their fingertips brushed, a shock of warmth surged through them, a tether of connection that illuminated the darkness surrounding them. In that moment, the fractured mirror revealed glimpses of their past, happy memories entwined with moments of pain. It reflected their childhood laughter, the comforting embrace of their mother, and the heartache of their father's loss. Each image was a thread woven into the fabric of their lives, a reminder of the strength they possessed as sisters. But the figure, lurking in the shadows, roared in anger, the air thickening with its presence. It surged forward, seeking to tear them apart, but Mina stood firm, focusing on the love they shared. The orb glowed brighter, filling the clearing with a radiant light that pushed back the darkness. Chloé blinked, her eyes clearing as she broke free from the trance. The moment their gazes locked, a rush of emotions surged between them: fear, love, and an unyielding bond. They were sisters, and together, they would confront the darkness that sought to consume them. With renewed resolve, they stepped forward, their hands intertwined. The orb pulsed in harmony with their connection, casting away the shadows that had haunted their family for so long. The figure roared in defiance, but the light pushed back with an intensity that shattered the darkness around them. As they approached the mirror, its surface shimmered with a kaleidoscope of colors, reflecting their combined strength. Mina and Chloé stood united. The bond between them solidified in that moment. They would not be torn apart. They were two halves of a whole, and together, they would reclaim their family. With one final surge of energy, they pressed their palms against the mirror, the light erupting from within them. The shadows screamed, twisting and contorting as the light enveloped them, pushing the darkness further and further back. The mirror cracked, shattering the hold the figure had over them. Mina and Chloé felt a rush of warmth as the light engulfed them, a promise of healing, of love, of hope. In that moment, they knew they could face whatever lay ahead, for they were not alone. As the darkness dissipated, the clearing transformed, blooming with vibrant colors and warmth. The shadows melted away, replaced by the light of a new dawn. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious, but the journey was far from over. Together, hand in hand, Mina and Chloé stepped back into the realm of the living, their hearts filled with determination. The orb flickered gently, a reminder of the strength they carried within. They would confront the challenges ahead, united against the shadows that threatened to tear them apart. In that moment, they knew that family was their greatest strength, and no darkness could ever break the bond they shared. Chapter 9. The Depths of Darkness. Mina stepped into the clearing, the vibrant light cascading around her like a radiant waterfall, dispelling the remnants of darkness that still lingered in the shadows. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation, each heartbeat echoing in the stillness. She could feel Chloé's presence more acutely now, a faint whisper of hope guiding her deeper into this realm caught between light and dark. As she moved forward, the landscape began to shift, the bright colors slowly fading into muted hues. The once vibrant flowers wilted, their petals dropping like forgotten memories. The sky dimmed, the ethereal glow giving way to a more foreboding atmosphere, heavy with an oppressive silence. Mina's breath quickened as she pressed on, aware that the deeper she went, the closer she would come to the source of the darkness that threatened her sister. The orb pulsed in her hand, its light flickering uncertainly in the growing shadows. It seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, growing warm and vibrant as she approached a vast expanse of darkness that stretched out before her like a gaping maw. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her, making it difficult to breathe. In the distance, she could see a figure, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of shadows. It loomed large, an ominous presence that sent a shiver down her spine. Despite the fear curling in her stomach, she felt drawn toward it, an inexplicable pull urging her to confront whatever lay ahead. With every step, the shadows whispered around her, the echoes of sorrow and despair reverberating through the air. They clawed at her mind, dredging up memories of pain and loss, reminding her of the fragile state of their family. Each whisper threatened to engulf her, to draw her into the depths of despair. But Mina pushed back, clenching the orb tightly. As she approached the figure, the shadows writhed and twisted, coiling around her like serpents. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, vibrating with the energy of the darkness that surrounded her. It was a living entity, a manifestation of all the pain they had endured, and it was hungry. Mina steadied herself, her resolve hardening. She had come too far to turn back now. Chloé needed her, and together, they could confront this darkness. With the orb radiating warmth in her grasp, she stepped closer to the looming figure, the air crackling with tension. The figure finally came into focus, revealing a reflection of herself twisted and warped, a dark doppelganger that mirrored her every move. Its eyes glinted with malice, a void of despair that threatened to consume her whole. The very essence of her fears and insecurities stood before her, a chilling reminder of what lay within. Mina felt her heart pound in her chest as the doppelganger extended a hand, beckoning her closer. The shadows swirled around it, a swirling vortex of darkness that threatened to engulf her. The temptation to succumb to her fears was overwhelming, but she grounded herself in the memories of her sister, the love they shared acting as an anchor against the tide of despair. As the doppelganger lunged forward, the orb pulsed brighter, illuminating the clearing with a fierce light. Mina faced the figure, unwavering, and in that moment, she realized that the darkness it represented could not harm her unless she allowed it to. The doppelganger was merely a reflection of her internal struggles, the pain she had yet to confront. Mina took a step forward, her voice unspoken yet resolute, summoning all the strength she possessed. The orb pulsed with energy, the light spilling out and surrounding her, pushing back against the shadows that threatened to close in around her. The figure hesitated, its twisted features faltering as the light began to dissolve the darkness. Mina felt the warmth of the orb radiating through her, filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows hissed in protest, swirling around her in a frenzied dance, but she stood firm, focusing on the bond she shared with Chloé. Together, they could overcome this darkness. As the light surged, the figure began to dissolve, its features melting away like wax in the heat. But just as she thought victory was within reach, the doppelganger let out a haunting wail, a sound filled with anguish that reverberated through the clearing. The shadows convulsed violently, writhing as if in pain, and for a moment, Mina felt a flicker of doubt, but she pushed it aside, channeling her energy into the orb, allowing the light to swell within her. The memories of her family flooded her mind, the laughter, the warmth, the love that had once filled their home. She could not let despair win. She would fight for her sister, for their family, and for the love that had been overshadowed by grief. With a fierce determination, Mina took another step forward, extending her hand toward the doppelganger. The orb glowed fiercely, casting out shadows as she confronted the darkness head-on. The doppelganger lunged again, but this time, Mina did not flinch. She met its gaze, unyielding, and spoke the words that echoed in her heart. In that moment, the ground beneath her shook, and the shadows screamed in fury. The orb exploded with a brilliant light, enveloping the clearing in a radiant glow that shattered the darkness around them. The doppelganger faltered, its form splintering as the light consumed it, the shadows collapsing in on themselves. Mina felt the surge of energy course through her as the light filled every corner of the clearing, illuminating the remnants of the darkness. The doppelganger let out one final wail before being swallowed by the brilliance, its form dissolving into a cascade of shimmering light. As the echoes of the darkness faded, the clearing transformed once more. The vibrant colors returned, the air lightened, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her lifted. Mina fell to her knees, breathing heavily, her heart racing with the exhilaration of victory. But amidst the joy, a lingering sense of urgency pushed her onward. Chloé was still out there, still trapped within the depths of the mirror. With renewed determination, Mina rose to her feet, the orb still glowing brightly in her hand. She felt the warmth of hope flooding her being, urging her to continue. She turned away from the clearing, retracing her steps back toward the path that had brought her here. The shadows no longer clung to her, their presence diminished in the wake of her confrontation. As she moved, the landscape shifted around her, the vibrant colors blending into a new horizon that beckoned her forward. Mina pressed on, the orb illuminating her way, guiding her through the depths of this otherworldly realm. With each step, she felt the connection to Chloé grow stronger, a tether that pulled her ever closer to her sister. The journey was not yet over, but she was no longer afraid. Together, they would face whatever darkness awaited them, and together, they would find their way back home. As she approached the next clearing, the air crackled with energy, a sense of anticipation building within her. She could feel the pull of Chloé, her sister's spirit shining like a beacon, guiding her through the shadows. With determination burning in her heart, Mina stepped forward, ready to reclaim her sister and break the chains that had bound them both for too long. The light from the orb flickered and swelled, illuminating the path ahead as she pressed onward, the promise of reunion drawing closer with every heartbeat. She would not falter. She would not give in. The love they shared would be their greatest weapon against the darkness, and together, they would reclaim their family's legacy of hope. Chapter 10. The Return to Light. Mina approached the next clearing with a sense of urgency, her heart racing in tandem with the pulse of the orb. The air hummed with energy, a powerful vibration that resonated through her very being. She could feel Chloé's presence intensifying, a flicker of light that shimmered in the depths of the shadows, guiding her closer. The clearing opened up before her like a sanctuary, a space where the oppressive darkness seemed to ebb away, giving way to a soft, ethereal glow. The ground was carpeted with lush grass, the vibrant colors returning in an explosion of hues. Flowers bloomed in wild abundance, their petals glistening with dew under a celestial sky that sparkled with starlight. Yet, amid the beauty, an undercurrent of unease thrummed, a reminder of the shadows that still lingered at the edges. Mina scanned the clearing, her heart aching with longing. She could feel Chloé's energy, pulsing with life and love, yet it felt distant, shrouded in an enigma that held her sister captive. The orb pulsed in her hand, casting a warm glow that illuminated the surroundings, beckoning her to move deeper into the light. The trees surrounding the clearing stood tall, their branches reaching out like ancient sentinels. They whispered to one another, their leaves rustling softly in a breeze that carried a hint of sweetness, as if the very air celebrated her arrival. But beneath the serene facade, a sense of urgency brewed, a reminder that time was not on her side. Mina pressed onward, following the trail of light that wound through the trees. Each step brought her closer to the core of this realm, where the veil between light and dark thinned. The shadows flickered at the periphery of her vision, a reminder that the darkness still lurked, waiting for an opportunity to strike. As she ventured further, she stumbled upon a pool of shimmering water nestled in the center of the clearing. Its surface sparkled like glass, reflecting the starlit sky above. The water exuded a sense of tranquility, but Mina sensed something deeper, a current of power that pulsed beneath the surface, resonating with her own heartbeat. Kneeling by the water's edge, Mina gazed into the depths. The orb in her hand glowed brightly, casting ripples of light that danced across the water. As the ripples settled, she caught a glimpse of Chloé, her sister's face emerging from the depths like a wisp of smoke. The image was fleeting, yet the connection was undeniable. Chloé was here, trapped within the mirror's realm, yearning to break free. Determined, Mina reached into the water, feeling the cool liquid envelop her fingers. The moment she made contact, the orb pulsed with intensity, resonating with the essence of her sister. The connection solidified, a bridge formed between their spirits, allowing Mina to feel Chloé's emotions: fear, sadness, but most importantly, an unyielding hope that anchored her to this world. With every passing second, the urgency grew stronger. The shadows lurked, restless and hungry, eager to snuff out the light. Mina closed her eyes, focusing on the bond they shared, envisioning their memories. The laughter in their childhood home, the late-night whispers, the warmth of sisterhood that had weathered storms and darkness. As she held onto those memories, the water began to swirl, the reflection of Chloé becoming clearer. Mina could see the glint of her sister's eyes, the spark of determination that mirrored her own. They were connected, two souls intertwined by love, standing strong against the forces that sought to tear them apart. Suddenly, the water erupted in a flash of brilliance, a surge of energy that sent ripples racing outward. The orb in Mina's hand flickered violently, its light illuminating the clearing as shadows writhed in protest. The darkness clawed at the edges, but Mina stood her ground, refusing to yield. With a deep breath, she plunged her hand deeper into the water, feeling the currents shift and swirl around her. The orb pulsed with ferocity, bathing the clearing in radiant light, pushing back against the encroaching shadows. Mina envisioned Chloé's face, her spirit resonating with the strength they shared. In a moment of clarity, she whispered her sister's name in her heart, willing Chloé to come forth. The water erupted once more, the energy surging in a brilliant explosion, illuminating the entire clearing in a cascade of light. The shadows shrieked in fury, twisting and writhing, but they were no match for the intensity of their bond. Then, as if responding to Mina's call, Chloé emerged from the depths, breaking free from the grip of the mirror. The radiant light enveloped her, illuminating her figure as she stepped onto the grassy bank. Mina's heart soared at the sight, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed the reunion that had felt so far away. The sisters stood before one another, their connection palpable, the energy swirling around them like a protective cocoon. They could feel the darkness receding, the shadows retreating in the wake of their united strength. Together, they were a force of light, unyielding and resolute. But the battle was not over. The shadows, though weakened, were not defeated. They slinked away, regrouping at the edges of the clearing, their menacing presence lurking like a storm on the horizon. Mina and Chloé locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. They would not allow the darkness to reclaim them. With the orb still glowing brightly in Mina's hand, they stood side by side, the warmth of their bond illuminating the path ahead. Together, they faced the shadows, the whispers of despair echoing in their ears, but they stood firm, united in their resolve. As the darkness surged forward, they held onto each other, their connection radiating through the air. The orb pulsed with a fierce energy, and in that moment, they became a singular entity, a beacon of light pushing back against the encroaching shadows. The shadows screeched, a cacophony of anger and anguish, but Mina and Chloé surged forward, their hands intertwined. The orb glowed brighter, casting a warm light that enveloped the clearing, driving the shadows back with an intensity that shook the very ground beneath them. The darkness writhed and twisted, but the sisters pressed on, determined to reclaim their home from the clutches of despair. The orb's light enveloped them, a shield against the malevolent forces that sought to tear them apart. In one final push, they advanced, their spirits intertwined, their love igniting a fire within. The orb burst forth with a blinding brilliance, the light radiating in waves that engulfed the shadows. They recoiled in terror, the darkness swirling and dissipating under the onslaught of love and light. With a final, resounding roar, the shadows shattered, dissolving into nothingness as the clearing erupted in an explosion of color and light. The oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace that settled over the landscape. Mina and Chloé stood together, breathless and radiant, the bond they shared illuminating the air around them. The shadows had been vanquished, the darkness pushed back into the void from whence it came. They had emerged victorious, but the journey was far from over. As the light faded, the clearing transformed once more, revealing the familiar contours of their childhood home. The once ominous atmosphere had transformed into a haven, the warmth of love and laughter flooding back into the space. The memories of joy and sorrow intertwined, creating a tapestry of their past, a testament to the strength of their family. Mina and Chloé took a step forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever awaited them in the future. They had weathered the storm, fought the darkness, and emerged victorious. With every step, they felt the warmth of hope blossoming in their hearts, an unbreakable bond that would guide them through the challenges ahead. As they crossed the threshold into their home, the walls seemed to sigh with relief, welcoming them back into the embrace of familiarity. The echoes of laughter reverberated through the hallways, the presence of their father lingering in the air. It was a reminder that love transcended even the darkest of times, and together, they would honor his memory. Mina and Chloé stepped into the heart of their home, where the light spilled through the windows, illuminating every corner. The shadows that had once haunted them had been dispelled, replaced by the warmth of love and the promise of healing. As they settled into their new reality, they knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, but they were no longer afraid. Together, they would navigate the challenges of grief, the intricacies of family, and the unbreakable bond of sisterhood that would carry them through the darkest of nights. The past would always be a part of them, but it would no longer define them. They had confronted the darkness, emerged victorious, and reclaimed their lives. And in the light of their love, they would continue to forge a path toward healing, holding onto the memories of those they had lost while embracing the beauty of the present. With each passing day, they would honor their father's legacy, their bond growing stronger as they navigated the journey of life together. Mina and Chloé stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever the future held, their hearts alight with hope and their spirits entwined in a dance of light and love. Together, they would write the next chapter of their lives, forever united against the darkness.